The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 2, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. The chairman laughed continually and gazed at the young widow with genuine admiration. From time to time he gave Griagor a wink as though saying, "That's the sort of women we've got, but you wouldn't believe me." Beyond the village, the brown, faded, autumnal steppe stretched away into the distance. A dove-gray ribbon of smoke dragged from the plowed lands across the road. The plowmen were burning the weeds. Dry, bushy hemp nettle, withered meadow grass. The scent of the smoke awakened mournful memories in Griagor. At one time, he too had plowed up the lands in the lonely autumnal steppe, had gazed at night into the black, star-sprinkled sky, had listened to the cries of the flocks of geese flying in the zenith. He shifted about, fidgeting on the hay, and looked at his driver. "How old are you, good woman?" "Close on 60, she said coquettishly, smiling with only her eyes. "No, without joking." "I'm in my 21st year." "And a widow?" "Yes." "Then what happened to your husband?" "He was killed." "Recently?" 2 years ago now." "During the rising, then?" "Afterwards, in the autumn." "And how do you manage?" "Oh, I manage, somehow." "Do you find life dreary?" She gazed at him attentively and pulled her kerchief over her lips to hide her smile. Her voice sounded thicker, and a new note crept into it when she answered, "There's no time for dreariness when you're at work." "But isn't it dreary without your husband?" "I live with my mother-in-law, and we've got plenty to do on the farm." "But how do you manage without your husband?" She turned her face towards Griagor. A flush played on her swarthy cheeks. Little ruddy sparks flamed up and faded in her eyes. "What are you getting at?" "Just what I said." She shifted her kerchief away from her lips and said with a drawl, "Well, there's enough of that blessing in this life. The world isn't entirely lacking in good men." After a pause, she went on, "I didn't get much chance of tasting the joys of woman's life with my husband. We only spent a month together, and then he was taken off into the army. I manage somehow without him. It's easier now young Cossacks have come back to the village, but before that it was hard. Gee up, bald head, gee up! So now you know, soldier, that's my life." Griagor said no more. He had no desire to carry on the conversation in such a bantering tone. Already he felt rather regretful that he had started it. The great, well-fed bullocks strode along steadily with the same measured, shambling gait. At some time or other one of them had had its right horn broken, and the horn had grown obliquely down over its head. Resting on his elbows, half-closing his eyes, Griagor lay in the wagon. He began to recall the bullocks he had worked with in his childhood and later, when he had grown up. They were all different in coloring, in build, in character. Even in their horns, each had its distinctive feature. At one time he had handled a bullock with a crumpled horn just like this one. Ill-tempered and cunning, it always looked out of the corners of its eyes, rolling its bloodshot whites. It tried to kick when approached from behind, and always in the field season, when the cattle were turned loose to graze on the steppe at night, it tried to make its way home, or still worse, hid in the forest or in the distant dells. Griagor had often spent a long day riding on horseback over the steppe, and after giving up hope of ever finding the lost bullock, had suddenly discovered it somewhere in the very bottom of a ravine, in an impenetrable thicket of thorn, or in the shade of an old and spreading crab-apple. That crumple-horned devil could slip its head out of the bullock lead, and at night it used to raise the crossbar of the gate to the cattle yard, would get out and, swimming across the dawn, would go wandering through the meadowland. Many an unpleasant and bitter moment had that bullock given Griagor in its time. "What's that bullock with the crumpled horn like? Quiet?" he asked the woman. "Yes. Why, what about it?" "I was only interested." "Only is a good word if there's nothing more to say," the woman pronounced with a sneer. Griagor was silent again. It was pleasant thinking about the past, about those days of peace, about work, about everything that had nothing to do with war. For that 7-year-long war had fed him up beyond words. and at the very recollection of it, of some episode connected with his army service, he felt a gripping nausea and numb irritation. He had done with fighting, had enough of it. He was riding home in order at last to betake himself to work, to live with his children, with Aksinya. While still at the front, he had firmly resolved to take Aksinya to himself, for her to rear his children, and to be always at his side. That story also must be ended, and the sooner the better. He dreamed with satisfaction of how, when he got home, he would take off his tunic and boots, would put on broad-fitting shoes, would tuck his trousers, Cossack fashion, into his white woolen stockings, and throwing his home-weave coat around his warm jacket, would drive off into the fields. It would be good to have his hands on the plow handles and walk along the damp furrow behind the plow, his nostrils greedily drinking in the raw and vapid scent of crumbling earth, the bitter smell of grass cut by the plowshare. In foreign countries, even the earth and the grasses had a different smell. More than once in Poland, in the Ukraine and the Crimea, he had rubbed a gray stalk of wormwood between his palms, had smelt it, and had yearningly thought, "No, it's not the same. It's different." But his driver was finding life boring. She felt inclined for conversation. She stopped urging on the bullocks, seated herself comfortably, and playing with the leather tassel of her knout, long and surreptitiously examined Gregor, his concentrated face, his half-closed eyes. He's not so very old, though he is gray, and he's a queer fellow somehow. He looks as though he'd seen some trouble in his time, but he isn't bad-looking, really. Only a lot of gray hair, and his mustache is almost gray, too. But otherwise he's not bad. What's he thinking so much for? At first it looked as though he was going to be jolly, but then he shut up and for some reason asked about the bullock. Doesn't he know what to talk about? Or perhaps he's shy. He doesn't look like it. He's got hard eyes. No, he's a good Cossack, only queer somehow. Well, then, keep your mouth shut, you hunchbacked devil. A lot of need I've got of you. I can hold my tongue, too. If you're writing to your wife, you'll never get there. Well, hold your tongue, and much good may it do you. She lolled with her head back against the ribs of the wagon and began to sing quietly. Gregor raised his head and gazed at the sun. The day was still young. A last year's thistle, which morosely stood guard over the road, threw a shadow the length of half a stride. In all probability, the time was no more than 2 in the afternoon. As though enchanted, the steppe lay in a dead silence. The sun warmed but little. A light breeze noiselessly stirred the reddish-brown withered grass. Neither bird's call nor marmot's whistle was to be heard at all. In the cold, pale blue sky, neither kites nor eagles were soaring. Only once did a gray shadow slip across the road, and without raising his head, Gregor heard the heavy sweep of great wings. An ashy-gray great bustard flew past, and settled close to a distant mound, where a hollow lying in shadow blended with the lilac gloom of the distance. In pre-war days, only late in the autumn, had Gregor known such a mournful and profound silence in the steppe, when it would seem to him that he heard the chickweed, caught up by the wind, go rustling over the sapless grass, traversing the steppe far, far ahead. It seemed that the road would never end. It wound up over a slope, dropped into a ravine, climbed again to the summit of a rise, and always the same, unbounded to the eye, the desolate pastureland of the steppe extended all around. Gregor's eyes were gladdened by a bush of maple growing on the slope of the ravine. Scorched by the first frosts, its leaves were glowing with a duskily livid hue, as though sprinkled with ash from the coals of a dying campfire. "What's your name, Daddy?" his driver asked, gently touching his shoulder with her knout. He started and turned his face to her. She looked away. "Gregor. And yours?" "Call me what you like." "You should keep quiet, what you like." "I'm tired of keeping quiet. I've been quiet for half a day. My mouth's quite dry." "Why are you so sad, Daddy Grisha?" "Well, why should I be merry?" You're going home, so you ought to be. My years of merriment have passed. Go on. You're an old man, aren't you? But why have you gone gray so young? You want to know everything. Of course I've gone gray as the result of the good life I've led. Are you married, Daddy Grisha? Yes, and you'd do well to find another husband quickly. Why? Well, you're a little too wanton. Is that so terrible? It can be. I knew one such wanton woman. She was a widow, too. She wantoned and wantoned, but then her nose began to drop off. By God, how terrible, the woman exclaimed in mock terror, and at once added in a businesslike tone, A widow's life is like that. If you're afraid of the wolf, don't go into the forest. Gregor glanced at her. She was laughing soundlessly, her fine white teeth pressed together. Her pouting upper lip twitched. Her eyes gleamed mischievously from beneath her drooping lashes. Gregor involuntarily smiled and laid his hand on her warm, rounded knee. Poor, unhappy wretch, he said commiseratingly. Only 20 short years, and how life has gnawed at you. In a flash, not a trace was left of her merriment. She roughly pushed his hand away, knitted her brows, and flushed so deeply that the tiny freckles vanished from the bridge of her nose. You pity your wife when you get home. I've got enough sympathizers and to spare without you. Don't be annoyed. Wait a bit. Oh, go to the devil. I said what I did because I was really sorry for you. You can take your sorrows straight. The masculine oath came fluently and easily to her lips, and her darkened eyes flashed. Gregor raised his eyebrows and muttered in confusion, Well, you can swear all right, there's no denying it. What an uncontrollable woman you are. And what are you? A saint in a lousy greatcoat? That's what. I know you. Get married and all the rest of it. But how long have you been so zealous? Not so very long, Gregor said with a laugh. Then why are you laying down the law to me for? I've got a mother-in-law who'll do that. Now that's enough. What are you so angry about, you fool of a woman? I only put it that way, Gregor said in a conciliatory tone. Now look, while we've been talking, the bullocks have got right off the road. Making himself more comfortable in the wagon, Gregor gave a swift glance at the merry widow, and noticed tears in her eyes. Well, that's the last straw. These women are always like that, he thought, feeling awkward and vexed. Soon afterwards he fell asleep, lying on his back, covering his face with the edge of his greatcoat, and awoke only as dusk was falling. The evening stars were faintly shining in the sky. He caught a fresh and joyous smell of hay. The bullocks have got to be fed, his driver said. All right, let's stop. Gregor himself unharnessed the bullocks, then took a tin of meat and bread out of his field pack. He collected a whole armful of dry scrub and made a fire not far from the wagon. Well, sit down and have some supper, he said to the woman. You've been angry long enough. She sat down by the fire and without a word shook bread and a piece of bacon fat, rusty with age, out of her sack. They talked little and amicably over the supper. Then she climbed into the wagon to sleep, while Gregor threw several clumps of bullock dung on the fire to keep it going, and stretched himself out beside it, soldier fashion. He lay for some time with his head resting on his field pack, gazing up at the sky, glittering with stars, disconnectedly thinking of his children, of Aksinya, then dozed off, and was awakened by a stealthy feminine voice. Are you asleep, soldier? Are you asleep or aren't you? He raised his head. Resting on her elbow, his companion was half hanging out of the wagon. Her face, lit up from below by the uncertain light of the dying fire, was rosy and fresh. Her teeth and the lacy edging of her headkerchief gleamed dazzlingly in the darkness. She smiled again as though there had been no words between them, and said, working her eyebrows, I'm afraid you'll freeze down there. The earth's cold. If you're very cold, come up with me. I've got a very warm sheepskin. You'll come, won't you? Gregor reflected for a moment and answered with a sigh, Thank you, girl, but I don't want to. Now, if it had been a year or two back, I don't think I'll freeze by the fire. She too sighed and said, Well, as you wish, and she drew her sheepskin over her head. A little later, Gregor rose to his feet and gathered his things. He had decided to continue on foot in order to reach Tatarsk by dawn. It was absurd for him, a commander returning from service, to ride home in broad daylight in a bullock wagon. Such a return would cause so much joking and talk. He aroused the woman. "I'm going on foot. You won't be afraid of being left alone in the steppe?" "No, I'm not a nervous sort, and there's a village not far off. But what's wrong? Getting impatient?" "You've guessed it." "Well, goodbye. Don't think badly of me." He took to the road and turned up the collar of his greatcoat. A first snowflake fell on his eyelashes. The wind had shifted to the north, and in its cold breath Gregor imagined he could catch the familiar and pleasant scent of snow. Koshevoy had gone to Vyeshenska and returned in the evening. Through the window Dunya saw him drive up to the gate, and she swiftly threw a shawl around her shoulders and went out into the yard. "Grisha arrived home this morning," she said at the wicket-gate, gazing at her husband anxiously and expectantly. "A great joy for you," Mishka answered, noncommittally, and with just a touch of humor. Firmly pressing his lips together, he went into the kitchen. Below his cheekbones the muscles were quivering. Polyushka had climbed up on Gregor's knee. Her aunt had solicitously attired her in a clean dress. Gregor carefully set the child on the floor and went to meet his brother-in-law, smiling and holding out his large, swarthy hand. He was about to embrace Mikhail, but noticed the cold, unfriendly look in his unsmiling eyes and refrained. "Well, greetings, Misha." "Greetings. It's a long time since we saw each other last. It seems like a century." "Yes, it's a long time. Welcome home." "Thank you. So we're kinsmen now." "Looks like it. What's that blood on your cheek?" "It's nothing. I cut myself with the razor in my hurry." They sat down at the table and silently examined each other, experiencing a feeling of awkwardness and estrangement. They would have to have a serious conversation together, but that was impossible at this moment. Mikhail was perfectly self-controlled, and he talked calmly about the farm and the changes which had occurred. Gregor gazed through the window at the earth covered with a first bluish snow, at the bare boughs of the apple tree. This was not how he had imagined his meeting with Mikhail. Not long afterwards, Misha went out. In the porch, he diligently sharpened his knife on a whetstone and said to Dunya, "I'm going to find someone to slaughter a lamb. After all, the master must be given a fitting welcome. Run and get some vodka. No, wait, go to Prokhor and tell him he's to get hold of vodka somewhere, even if he has to wear his feet out. He can do it better than you. Invite him along for the evening." Dunya beamed with joy and gave her husband a look of silent gratitude. Maybe everything will take a good turn. They've done fighting. What else are they to do now? May God bring them to reason, she thought hopefully as she made her way to Prokhor's hut. Less than half an hour later, Prokhor came running in, panting. "Gregor Pantelyevich, old lad, I never expected to see this day," he shouted in a high-pitched, weeping voice, and stumbling over the threshold, all but smashed the great ewer of vodka he was carrying. He embraced Gregor, sobbing, wiping his eyes with his fist, stroking his mustache, from which tears were dripping. Something quivered in Gregor's throat, but he restrained himself. Deeply moved, he roughly clapped his faithful orderly on the back and said incoherently, "Well, so we've seen each other again. Well, and I'm glad, Prokhor, terribly glad. What are you crying for, old lad? Grown weak in the guts? The nuts working loose? How is your arm? So your wife hasn't torn your other one off yet?" Prokhor blew his nose violently and removed his sheepskin. "The old woman and I live together these days like a couple of doves. You can see my second arm is whole, but the one which the Poles took off is beginning to grow again. God's truth. In a year now you'll be seeing fingers on it," he said with his customary cheeriness, shaking the empty sleeve of his shirt. War had taught each of them to hide his real feelings behind a smile, to savor both bread and talk with a grain of salt. And so Gregor continued his questioning in the same jesting tone. "How are you living, you old goat? How are you bucking? Like an old man, not in too great a haste? You haven't killed anything else since you left me? What are you getting at? Why, the nightingales you brought me last winter." "Pantelyevich, God forbid! What use would such a luxury be now? And besides, what sort of marksman am I with only one arm? That's your business. That's a young man's job. But it's high time I gave my affairs to a woman to grease and turned to licking out frying pans." They stood gazing at each other, these old trench comrades, laughing and rejoicing in the meeting. "Home for good?" Prokhor asked. "For good. Absolutely. What rank did you win your way to?" "I was vice-commander of the regiment." "Then why did they discharge you so soon?" Griegor's face clouded, and he answered curtly, "They had no more use for me." "And why was that?" "I don't know. Because of my past, I expect." "But you got through that special department commission, which sifted out all the officers, so how can they bring up the past now?" "Who's to say?" "But where's Mikhail?" "In the yard. He's slaughtering a lamb." Prokhor moved closer to Griegor and lowered his voice. "They shot Platon Ryabchikov a month ago." "What are you saying?" "It's God's truth." In the porch the door creaked. "We'll talk later," Prokhor whispered, and in a louder tone, "Well, comrade commander, shall we drink to celebrate this great happiness? Shall I go and call Mikhail?" "Yes, do." Dunya laid the table. She did not know how best to please her brother. She laid a clean hand towel over his knee, pushed across a tray of salted watermelon, polished his glass at least 5 times. With a smile, Griegor mentally noted that Dunya was not addressing him in the second-person singular as her brother, but in the plural. At the table, Mikhail was obstinately silent, attentively listening to Griegor's talk. He drank little, and that reluctantly, but Prokhor threw back a full glass at a time and only turned livid and stroked his lint-white mustache more frequently with his hand. When she had fed the children and put them to bed, Dunya placed a large dish of stewed lamb on the table and whispered to Griegor, "Brother, I'll run and fetch Aksinya. You won't mind, will you?" Griegor nodded without speaking. All the evening he had been in a state of tense expectation, yet he had felt sure nobody had noticed it. But Dunya had seen him pricking up his ears at every knock, listening and glancing sidelong at the door. Nothing whatever could escape the attention of that girl's unnecessarily sharp eyes. "And Tereshchenko, the Kuban, is he still in command of a troop?" Prokhor asked, holding his glass tightly in his hand, as though afraid someone would take it from him. "He was killed at Lvov." "Well, may he enter the heavenly kingdom. He was a good cavalryman." Prokhor hurriedly crossed himself, and not noticing Koshevoy's venomous smile, took a pull at his glass. "And how about that one with the queer name? The one that rode on the right flank. Damn it, what was his name? Maybeard, wasn't it? A Ukrainian, very stocky and merry. The one who split a Polish officer in 2 at Brada. Is he alive and well?" "Like a stallion. He's been transferred to a machine-gun squadron." "And who did you hand over your horse to?" "I'd got another by then." "Then what happened to the one with the star?" "He was killed by a fragment of shell." "In battle?" "We were standing in a small town and were raked with fire. He was killed at the hitching post." "Ah, pity. What a good horse he was." Prokhor sighed and again set his lips to the glass. The latch rattled in the porch. Griegor started. Aksinya crossed the threshold, indistinctly said greetings, and began to take off her kerchief, panting and not removing her dilated, radiant eyes from Griegor. She came to the table and sat down beside Dunya. Tiny snowflakes were melting on her eyebrows and lashes and on her pale cheeks. Screwing up her eyes, she wiped her face with her palm, sighed deeply, and only then, mastering herself, looked at Griegor again with eyes darkened with emotion. "Fellow soldier, Aksinya, together we retreated, together we fed the lice. Even if we did abandon you in the Kuban, what else were we to do?" Prokhor stretched out his glass, splashing the vodka over the table. "Drink to Griegor Pantelyevich. Congratulate him on his return. I told you he'd return safe and sound, and there he is. You can have him for 20 rubles. Why, he's sitting like a man who's been cheated." "He's already canned, neighbor. Don't listen to him," Griegor laughed, indicating Prokhor with his eyes. Aksinya bowed to Griegor and Dunya, and only raised her glass a little from the table. She was afraid everybody would notice how her hand was trembling. Here's to your arrival, Gregor Pantelyevich, and to your joy, Dunya. And what about you? To your sorrow? Prokhor burst into a roar and nudged Mikhail in the side. Aksinya flushed deeply. Even the tiny lobes of her ears went translucently rosy. But looking firmly and angrily at Prokhor, she answered, "And to my joy, my great joy." Prokhor was disarmed and touched by such frankness. He cried, "Drink it down, for God's sake, all to the last drop. You know how to talk straight, know how to drink straight. It's like a sharp knife in my heart when I see anyone leaving good liquor." Aksinya did not remain long, only so long as decorum permitted in her judgment. During all her stay she rarely looked at her beloved, and then only momentarily. She forced herself to look at the others and avoided Gregor's eyes, for she could not pretend to be unconcerned. And she did not wish to reveal her feelings to outsiders. Only one glance did Gregor catch as she stood on the threshold, one direct glance filled with love and devotion. But with it everything was said. He went to see her out. The tipsy Prokhor shouted after them, "Don't be long, we'll drink it all up." In the porch, Gregor, without saying a word, kissed Aksinya on the brow and the lips and asked, "Well, Aksinya? Oh, I can't tell everything. Will you come tomorrow?" "I will." She hastened home, walking swiftly as though some urgent task were awaiting her there. Only by the door of her hut did she slow her pace, going cautiously up the creaking steps. She wanted as quickly as possible to be alone with her thoughts, with the happiness which had come so unexpectedly. She threw off her jacket and kerchief, and lighting no light, passed into the best room. Through the unshuttered window the deep lilac glimmer of the night stole into the room. Behind the stove a cricket was ringingly chirruping. Out of habit Aksinya glanced at the mirror, and although in the darkness she could not see her reflection, nonetheless she tidied her hair, smoothed out the frills of her muslin blouse at the breast, then went across to the window and tiredly dropped on the bench. Many times in her life had her hopes and expectations been unjustified, and that perhaps is why her constant anxiety came to take the place of her recent joy. What turn would her life take now? What awaited her in the future? And wasn't woman's bitter happiness smiling on her too late? Worn out with the agitation she had felt all the evening, she sat with her cheek pressed to the cold, hoar-frosted window glass, fixing her calm and rather sorrowful gaze on the darkness, which was lightened only very little by the snow. Gregor sat down at the table, poured himself out a full glass from the ewer, and tossed it off in one gulp. "Is it good?" Prokhor asked. "I can't tell. I haven't drunk for ages." "It's just like Tsarist vodka, by God," Prokhor said in a tone of conviction, and swaying, embraced Mishka. "You're less of a judge of such matters, Mishka, than a calf is of swill, but I know what's what where liquor's concerned. The liquors and wines I've come to drink in my time. There's wine which foams out of the bottle like out of a mad dog almost before you've pulled the cork. God knows I'm not lying. In Poland, when we broke through the front and rode with Budzioni to shake up the Poles, we took a certain estate by storm. The house on the estate was a couple or more stories high. The cattle in the yard were packed horn to horn. There were all sorts of fowl wandering about. There wasn't even room to spit. In a word, that landowner lived like a prince. When our troop dashed into the estate on horseback, there were officers feasting with the master. They weren't expecting us. We sabred them all in the orchard and on the stairs, but we took one prisoner. He was an important officer by the look of him, but when we captured him, his mustache went limp, and he sweated all over with fear. Gregor Pantelyevich had been called urgently to the staff, and we were left in charge. We went into the downstairs rooms, and there we saw an enormous table, and the stuff that was on it. We stood admiring, but we were afraid to begin, though we were terribly hungry. You never know, we thought. It may all be poisoned. Our prisoner looked like the devil to us. We ordered him, "Eat," and he ate. Not very readily, but he did eat. "Drink," and he drank. We made him eat a large helping of every dish and drink a glass out of every bottle. The devil swelled up before our very eyes with all that food, and there we stood, dribbling with spittle. Then we saw that he wasn't dying, and we set to work. We ate and we drank the foaming wine till we were stuffed up to our eyes. Then we noticed that the officer was starting to empty himself at both ends. Hell, we thought, we're done for. The serpent has deliberately eaten the poisoned food and taken in the lot of us. We rushed at him with our sabers drawn, but he waved his legs and arms and shouted, "I've only eaten too much through your kindness. Never you fear, the food's all right." And so we went back to the wine. We tugged at a cork, and it flew out as though shot from a gun, and the broth boiled up in a cloud until it was alarming to watch. Through the wine, I fell off my horse 3 times that night. The moment I climbed into my saddle, I was sent flying again as though blown clean off by the wind. Now, if only I could always drink wine like that, a glass or 2 on an empty stomach, I'd live to be 100. But as things are, is anyone likely to live out his time? Do you call this drink, for instance? It's an infection, not a drink. It's enough to make you turn up your toes before your time. With a nod, Prokhor indicated the ewer of vodka and poured himself out another glass full to the brim. Dunya went off to sleep with the children in the best room, and a little later Prokhor also rose. Swaying, he flung his sheepskin coat around his shoulders and said, "I won't take the ewer. My soul won't allow me to go about with an empty vessel. When I got home, my wife would start laying it on at once. She's a good one for that. Where does she get such filthy expressions from? I don't know. I came home after a little drunk, and she rants off at me like this: 'You drunken hound, you armless dog, you this and that and the other.' I very quietly and very gently try to make her see reason. I tell her, 'You devilish idiot, you bitch's udder, where did you ever see a drunken hound, and armless at that? Such things don't exist in this world.' I disprove one shameful statement, and she at once makes another. I disprove the second, and she insults me with a third, and so it goes on all night until dawn. Sometimes I get tired of listening to her and go off under the shed to sleep. But sometimes I come home a little drunk, and if she's silent and doesn't swear at me, I can't get to sleep, God's truth. It's just as though I was short of something. I get a kind of itch. I can't sleep, and there's an end of it. And then I touch my spouse, and she starts ranting off at me again until the sparks fly from me. She takes it out of me, and I can't get away from it. Let her carry on. She'll be all the better worker. That's true, isn't it? Well, I'm going. Goodbye. Or shall I spend the night in the stable and not disturb her tonight?" "Can you get home all right?" Griegor asked with a laugh. "Like a crab, but I'll crawl there." "Am I not a Cossack, then, Pantelyevich? I'm quite upset to hear you ask such a question." "Well, then, God go with you." Griegor saw his friend as far as the wicket gate. Then he returned to the kitchen. "Well, shall we have a talk, Mikhail?" "All right." They sat opposite each other, separated by the table, and were silent. At last, Griegor said, "There's something between us. I can see by your face that there's something wrong. Aren't you glad of my arrival, or am I wrong?" "No, you've guessed right. I'm not glad." "Why aren't you?" "It means unnecessary anxiety." "I think I can manage to feed myself." "I'm not thinking of that." "Then what are you thinking of?" "You and I are enemies." "We were?" "Yes, and it's clear that we shall be." "I don't understand. Why shall we?" "You're unreliable. You're right off the mark. You're talking right off the mark." "No, I'm not." "Why have you been demobilized at such a time? Will you tell me straight out?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do, but you don't want to say." "They didn't trust you, isn't that it?" "If they hadn't trusted me, they wouldn't have put me in command of a squadron." "That was when you first joined. But as they haven't kept you in the army, the position's quite clear, brother." "But do you trust me?" Griegor asked, gazing straight at Mishka. "No. Feed the wolf as much as you like. He's always hankering after the forest." "You've drunk too much this evening, Mikhail." "You can drop that. I'm no more drunk than you are." "They didn't trust you there, and they won't put any great trust in you here. Get that?" Griegor was silent. He lackadaisically took a piece of salted cucumber from the dish, chewed it, and spat it out. "Has my wife told you about Kirill Gromov?" Mikhail asked. "Yes." "I didn't like his return either. As soon as I heard about it, that very same day—" Griegor turned pale, and his eyes dilated with fury. "What am I to you, then? Kirill Gromov? Don't shout. In what way are you any better? Well, you know? It's not a question of knowing. We've known everything long since. And supposing Mitka Korshunov turns up, am I to be delighted at that, too? No. It would have been better if you hadn't shown yourself in the village. Better for you, better for me, and better for the people. Quieter. Don't compare me with those others. I've already told you, Gregor, and there's no point in getting upset about it. You're no better than they are. In fact, you're worse. You're more dangerous. How am I? What are you getting at? They're rank-and-file Cossacks, but you started the rising. I didn't start it. I was only commander of a division. And is that nothing? Little or much, that's not the point. If the Red Army men hadn't planned to kill me that evening, I might not have taken any part in the rising. If you hadn't been an officer, no one would have touched you. If I hadn't been taken for the army, I wouldn't have been an officer. That's making a long story of it. Both a long and a filthy story. In any case, it can't be gone over again. Now it's past and done. They smoked in silence. Knocking the ash off his cigarette with his nail, Koshevoy said, I know all about your heroism. I've heard about it. You killed a lot of our men, and that doesn't make it easy for me to have you in my sight. That's not to be forgotten in a hurry. Gregor laughed sarcastically. You've got a good memory. You killed my brother Pyotr, but I don't bother to remind you of that. If we're going to remember everything, we'll have to live like wolves. Well, I did kill him, I don't deny it. And if I'd had the luck to catch you that time, I'd have stretched you out, too, like a lover. But when they took Ivan Alexeyevich prisoner at Ust-Harpiersk, I hurried home because I was afraid you might be among them. I was afraid the Cossacks would kill you. It looks as if I was in too much of a hurry that time. So I've got a protector now. I can imagine how you'd have talked to me if you'd won. You'd have torn my back into ribbons, I expect. It's only now that you're turning so kind. Maybe others would flay you alive, but I wouldn't soil my hands on you. Then you and I are made differently. I've never been afraid of soiling my hands on enemies, and I shan't turn a hair now if the need arises. Mikhail poured the rest of the vodka into the glasses and asked, Will you drink? All right. We've grown too sober for such talk. They clinked glasses in silence and drank. Gregor leaned his chest against the table and, twisting his mustache, stared at Mikhail through half-closed eyes. But what is it you're afraid of, Mikhail? That I shall revolt against the Soviet regime again? I'm not afraid of anything. But what I do think is that if anything happens to flare up, you'll be slipping across to the other side, too. I could have done that with the Poles, don't you think? We had a whole regiment go over to them. Couldn't you manage it? It wasn't that, I just didn't want to. I've served my time. I don't want to serve anybody anymore. I've fought more than enough for my age, and I'm absolutely worn out. I'm fed up with everything, with the revolution and with the counter-revolution. Let it all go to hell. I want to live the rest of my life with my children, to return to the farm, that's all. Believe me, Mikhail, I say that from the bottom of my heart. For that matter, no assurance whatever could convince Mikhail. Gregor realized that and said no more. He felt a momentary bitter annoyance with himself. What the devil had he tried to justify himself for, tried to prove anything for? What was the point of carrying on this drunken conversation and listening to Mikhail's idiotic sermons? To hell with it all. He rose. We won't go on with this useless talk. I've had enough. One thing I want to say to you is my final word. I shan't do anything against the regime so long as it doesn't seize me by the throat. But if it does, I shall defend myself. In any case, I'm not going to yield up my head over the rising as Platon Ryabchikov has. What do you mean? What I say. Let them take account of my service in the Red Army and the wounds I got as the result. I'm prepared to go to prison for the rising. But if it's a case of being shot for it, then excuse me. That'll be asking too much. Mikhail laughed contemptuously. You've got a fine idea into your head. The Revolutionary Tribunal or the Cheka won't ask you what you want and what you don't want, and they won't strike any bargain with you. Once you've been found guilty, you receive your ration with make-weight. The old debts have got to be paid off in full. Well, then we'll see. We'll see, sure enough. Gregor took off his belt and shirt, then, grunting with the effort, began to pull off his boots. "Shall we share the farm?" he asked, unnecessarily examining the sole of his boot, which was coming away from the upper. "The share-out won't take long. I'll put my hut in order and go there to live." "Yes, we'd better separate in any case. You and I will never get on together." "You're right," Mikhail confirmed. "I didn't think you'd have such an opinion of me." Well, I've spoken straight out. I've said what I thought. When are you going to Vyashenska?" "Sometime or other during the next day or two." "Not sometime or other. You've got to go tomorrow." "I've come almost 25 miles on foot, and I'm tired out. I'll take a rest tomorrow and go and register the day after." "The order is that registration must be immediate. Go tomorrow." "Don't I need any rest? I shan't run away." "The devil knows. I don't want to be responsible for you." "What a swine you've become, Mikhail," Gregor said, studying the harsh face of his former friend, not without astonishment. "Don't you call me a swine. I'm not used to it." Mikhail took a breath and raised his voice. "You know, you've got to drop your officer's ways. I say you go to Vyashenska tomorrow, and if you won't go of your own accord, I'll send you there under convoy, understand?" "Now I understand everything." Gregor stared with a look of hatred at his brother-in-law's back as Mikhail went to his room and lay down on the bed without undressing. Well, everything had happened as it was bound to happen, and why should he be given any different welcome? Why, indeed, had he thought that his brief period of faithful service in the Red Army would atone for all his past sins? And perhaps Mikhail was right in saying that not everything was forgivable, and that the old debts had to be paid in full. In his sleep, Gregor saw the spacious steppe and a regiment deployed for attack. Just as from somewhere in the distance came a long, drawn-out command, "Squadron!" he realized that his saddle girths were not tightened under his horse. He put all the weight of his body on the right stirrup. His saddle slipped away under him. Possessed with a feeling of shame and fear, he leaped from his horse to tighten the saddle girths, and at that very moment heard the momentarily increasing and then tempestuously decreasing thunder of horse hoofs. The regiment had galloped into the attack without him. He turned over, and awakening, caught the sound of his own hoarse groan. Outside the window, day was just beginning to appear. The wind must have opened the shutter during the night, and through the hoar-frosted glass he could see the gleaming green disk of the waning moon. He groped for his pouch and lit a cigarette. His heart was still pounding hollowly and swiftly. He lay on his back and smiled. Fancy dreaming such a hellish dream. To be left out of the fight. In that early morning hour it did not occur to him that he would yet go into the attack more than once, not only in his dreams, but in his waking hours. The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 2, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. Chapter 7. Dunya got up early. She had to milk the cow. Gregor was walking quietly about the kitchen, coughing. Drawing the blanket over the children, Dunya swiftly dressed and went into the kitchen. She found her brother buttoning his greatcoat. "Where are you off to so early, brother?" "I'm going for a walk through the village, just to have a look round." "You should have some breakfast first." "I don't want any. I've got a headache." "Will you be back by breakfast time? I'm just going to light the stove." "You needn't wait for me. I shan't be back for some time." Gregor went out into the street. Towards morning a gentle thaw had set in. The wind blowing from the south was moist and warm. Snow, mingled with earth, clung to the heels of his boots. As he walked slowly towards the center of the village, he attentively examined the houses and sheds, familiar to him ever since childhood, as though he were in a strange locality. The charred ruins of the merchants' houses and shops burned down by Koshevoy the previous year showed black in the square. The half-demolished church wall yawned with gaps. The bricks have come in useful for stoves, Gregor thought unconcernedly. The church stood as of old, small, huddling into the ground. Its long, unpainted roof was gilded with rust, Its walls were variegated with brown stains of dampness, and where the plaster had fallen away, the bare brick showed a bright, fresh red. The streets were deserted. 2 or 3 sleepy-eyed women passed him not far from the well. They bowed silently to him as though he were a stranger, and only when he had passed did they halt and stand staring after him. He turned back. I ought to go to the graveyard to visit Mother and Natalia, he thought, and walked along a lane leading in the direction of the cemetery. But after going a little distance he halted. His heart was heavy and sorrowful enough without that. I'll go some other time, he decided, turning to make his way to Prokhor's hut. It's all the same to them whether I come or not. They're at peace now. It's all over for them. Their graves are blanketed with snow. But the earth must be cold down inside there. Well, they lived their time, and so quickly, as though in a dream. There they all lie together, side by side, my wife and mother and Pyotr and Darya. The entire family has crossed to the other side and lie there, side by side. They're well off there, but Father alone is lying in a strange country. He must find it dreary among strangers. Griegor no longer looked about him, but walked along, gazing down at his feet, at the white, slightly damp, thawing snow, which was very soft, so soft that one did not even feel it underfoot, and it made hardly any scrunch. Then his thoughts turned to his children. They had grown strangely reserved, taciturn for their years, not as they had been when their mother was alive. Death had taken too much from them. They were frightened. Why had Polyushka broken into tears yesterday when she saw him? Children don't usually cry when they meet anyone. It was not like them. What had she been thinking about? And why did fear flash into her eyes when he took her hand? Maybe all this time she had been thinking her father was dead and would never come back any more. And then when she saw him, she had been afraid. In any case, he had no reason to reproach himself in regard to them, but he must tell Aksinya to have pity on them, and to try to take their mother's place as far as she could. Maybe they would grow attached to their stepmother. She was a good, kind woman. In her love for him, she would love the children too. He found this subject also painful and bitter to think about. It was not so simple as all that. Life itself was proving to be not so simple as it had seemed to him only recently. In his stupid, childish naivete, he had assumed that he had only to return home, to change his greatcoat for a peasant's coat, and everything would go according to prescription. No one would say a word to him, nobody would reproach him, everything would settle down of itself, and he would live and end his days as a peaceable grain-grower and a model villager. But no, the reality didn't look quite so simple. He cautiously opened Zhikov's wicket gate, which was hanging by one hinge. Wearing well-patched, huge felt boots and a 3-cornered cap drawn right down over his eyes, Prokhor was walking towards the steps, jauntily swinging an empty milk pail. White drops of milk sprinkled invisibly over the snow. "Had a good night, Comrade Commander?" he greeted Griegor. "Praise be. Getting drunk's good work. But why is the pail empty? Have you been milking the cow yourself?" With a nod, Prokhor shifted his cap to the back of his head, and only then did Griegor notice that his friend's face was gloomy. "Well, is the devil going to milk her for me? Yes, I've milked her, the accursed female. I only hope she gets a bellyache as the result." Prokhor furiously flung away the pail and curtly said, "Let's go into the hut." "How about your wife?" Griegor asked irresolutely. "The devils have eaten her with kvass. Before there was any sign of dawn, she raked herself together and drove off to Kruzhelinsky for firewood. She said about me as soon as I arrived home after leaving you last night. She lectured me and gave me further orders and then jumped up. I'm going off to get some firewood. Maksayev's daughters-in-law are going today, and I'll go with them. Go, by all means, I thought. Go for pears, if you like, and a smooth road to you. I got up, lit the stove, and went to milk the cow. I milked her, all right. Do you think a man's capable of doing such things with only one arm? You should have asked some woman to do it for you, you idiot. A sheep's an idiot. It'll suck at its mother until the feast of the Blessed Virgin. But all my life, I've never been an idiot. I thought I'd manage it by myself. Well, and I did. I crawled under that cow on all fours, but damn her, she wouldn't stand still, but shifted about all the time. I even took my cap off in order not to alarm her, but it made no difference. My shirt got wet through with sweat while I was milking her, and I had hardly stretched out my hand to take the pail from under her when she let fly with her leg. The pail went one way and I the other, and that's how I milked her. She's not a cow, she's a devil with horns. I spat into her face and left her. I can do without milk. Shall we have a drink? Have you got any? 1 bottle, extra good. Well, it'll be enough. Come in, be my guest. Shall I fry you some eggs? I can get them ready in 2 seconds. Griegor cut up some fat bacon and helped Prokhor to get the fire going at the front of the stove. They watched without talking as the pieces of rosy fat hissed, melted, and slipped about the frying pan. Then Prokhor drew out a dusty bottle from behind the icon cupboard. That's where I keep all my secrets from my wife, he explained briefly. They ate in the small, well-heated best room, drank and talked in undertones. With whom could Griegor share his most secret thoughts, if not with Prokhor? He sat at the table, his long, muscular legs spread wide apart, and his hoarse, deep voice sounded husky. While I was in the army and all the way home, I thought of how I'd live close to the earth and rest among my family from all the devilish business of war. It's no joke not to have slipped off your horse for 8 years, so to speak. Even in your dreams, and almost every night, you dream of all that glory. Either you're killing someone or they're killing you. But now I can see, Prokhor, that it's not going to turn out as I thought. I can see that others, not I, are going to plow the land, to take care of it. Did you have a talk with Mikhail yesterday? I had that honeyed pleasure. And what did he say? Griegor crossed his fingers. That's the state of our friendship. He's throwing my service with the whites up in my face, but he thinks I'm nursing designs against the new regime, hiding a knife against it in my breast. He's afraid there will be a rising, but what the devil I want it for, he himself doesn't know, the fool. He said the same thing to me. Griegor smiled cheerlessly. During our advance on Poland, we came across a certain Ukrainian who asked us for arms to defend his village. Bandits had entered the place, plundered them all, and slaughtered their cattle. The commander of our regiment, I was present at the time, said, "Give you arms and you'll go off to the bandits yourself." But the Ukrainian laughed and said, "You only arm us, comrade, and then we'll not only keep the bandits out of the village, but you too." And just now I'm thinking rather like that Ukrainian. If only it was possible to have neither whites nor reds in Tatarsk, it would be much better. In my view, my kinsmen, Mitka Korshunov, say, and Mikhail Koshevoy, are both tarred with the same brush. Mikhail thinks I'm so devoted to the whites that I can't live without them. The horseradish. I'm devoted to them all right. Recently, when we were advancing into the Crimea, I happened to run up against a Kornilov officer in a fight. A brisk little colonel, with his mustache trimmed English fashion, 2 streaks like snot under his nose, and I tackled him with such fervor that my heart leaped for joy. I left that poor little colonel with half his cap and half his head on his shoulders, and his officer's white cockade went flying. That's how much I'm devoted to them. They, too, have salted my life more than enough. With my own blood I earned my way to that accursed officer's rank, but among the officers I was like a white crow. The swine, they never regarded me as a man. They scorned giving me their hands. And do you think that after that, they can go to hell? It makes me sick even to talk about it, and to suggest that I should want to restore their regime again, to invite the General Fichelarovs here. I've tried that game once, and I was hiccuping for a whole year after. I've had enough. I've learned my lesson. I've felt it all on my own back. As he soaked his bread in the hot fat, Prokhor said, "There isn't going to be any rising. To begin with, there are only a few Cossacks left, and those who've come through have also learned their lesson. They've shed the blood of their brothers to further orders, and they've grown so peaceable and sensible that you couldn't drag them into a rising at the end of a rope. And besides, the people have grown hungry for a peaceful life. You should have seen how everybody worked this summer. They piled great stacks of hay and harvested all the corn down to the last grain. They're groaning with the effort, but they're plowing and sowing as though you'd say every one of them intended to live 100 years. No, there's no point in talking about a rising. It's stupid talking about it, though the devil knows what the Cossacks may get into their heads next. What can they get into their heads? What are you hinting at? Neighbors of ours have got it into their heads. Well? Call it well if you like. A rising has broken out in Voronezh province, somewhere beyond Baguchar. That's all rot. Why is it? A militiaman I know told me about it yesterday. It seems the authorities are intending to send the militia there. But where's there? To Monastirshchizna, Sukhoy Donets, Pasieka, Stara, and Novokalitva, and elsewhere in that district. They say it's quite a big rising. Why didn't you say anything about it yesterday, you plucked goose? I didn't want to in front of Mikhail. And besides, there's no pleasure in talking about such things. I never want to hear another word about that sort of thing. Grigory grew glum. After long reflection, he said, That's bad news. There's nothing to do with you. Let the Chochols worry about it. They'll have their arses beaten into sores, and then they'll learn how to rise. But it's nothing whatever to do with you and me. I don't feel at all sorry for them. It'll make things difficult for me, though. Why will it? Can't you see? If the regional authorities have the same opinion of me as Koshevoy, then I shan't be able to avoid unpleasantness. A rising in the next province, and I a former officer and an insurgent into the bargain. Now do you see? Prokhor stopped chewing and sat thinking. This aspect had not occurred to him before. His head was fuddled with drink, and he thought slowly and painfully, But where do you come in, Panteleyevich? He asked in astonishment. Grigory knitted his brows in his vexation, and did not answer. He was obviously disturbed by the news. Prokhor was about to pass his glass across to him, but he pushed his friend's hand away and said resolutely, I'm not having any more. But won't you have just one more? Drink till you turn black. The only way of stifling this joyful life is with vodka. Turn black by yourself. Your head's stupid enough already. It'll be the death of you sooner or later. I've got to go to Vyazhenska today to register. Prokhor gazed fixedly at him. Grigory's sunburn and weather-beaten face burned with a deep brown flush. His skin was a dull white only at the very roots of the hair combed back off his forehead. He was calm enough, this soldier who had seen so much, with whom war and adversity had made Prokhor kin. His rather prominent eyes had a morose gaze, a look of harsh weariness. You aren't afraid they'll put you in prison? Prokhor asked. Grigory warmly answered, That's just what I'm afraid of, my lad. I never have been in prison, and I fear prisons more than death. But it's clear that I've got to experience that happiness, too. You shouldn't have come home, Prokhor said commiseratingly. But where else was I to go? You should have hidden somewhere in a town and waited till all this business is settled down, and then come home. Grigory waved his hand and laughed. That's not my way. To wait till you're caught is worst of all. And how could I leave the children? A fine idea. Haven't they lived without you already? You could have taken them later, and your darling, too. And by the way, I forgot to tell you. Your masters, those you and Aksinya worked for before the war, have both gone. The Listnitskys? That's the name. My kinsman Zakhar retreated as orderly to the younger Listnitsky, and he told me the old man died of typhus at Morozovsky, but the younger got as far as Yekaterinodar, and there his wife had an affair with General Pokrovsky, and he couldn't stand it, so he shot himself in his temper. Well, they can go to the devil, Grigory said unconcernedly. I'm sorry for the good men that have been lost, but nobody's going to be sorry for those two. He rose, put on his greatcoat, and as he held the door handle, said reflectively, Though, damn it, I always felt envious of such men as the younger Listnitsky or Koshevoy. Everything was clear to them from the very beginning, but nothing is clear to me even now. Both of them saw straight roads before them, and saw the ends of them. But ever since 1917, I've been going round and round in a circle, reeling like a drunken man. I broke away from the whites, but I didn't join up with the reds, and I float like dung in a hole in the ice. You see, Prokhor, Of course I ought to have remained in the Red Army until the end. Maybe then everything would have gone well for me. And at first, I served the Soviet regime with all my heart. But afterwards everything went wrong. I was a stranger among the whites, among their command. They always suspected me. And how could it be otherwise? The son of a farmer, an illiterate Cossack? What kinship had I with them? They just didn't trust me. And afterwards it was just the same with the Reds. After all, I'm not blind. I saw how the Commissar and the communists in the squadron watched me. During a battle, they didn't take their eyes off me. They watched my every step. And I suppose they were thinking, that swine, the former white, the Cossack officer, we must see he doesn't betray us. And when I noticed it, my heart ran cold. Towards the end, I couldn't stand their distrust any longer. After all, even a stone will split with heat, and it was a good job they did to demobilize me. It brought the end nearer. He cleared his throat huskily, said nothing for a moment, and then, not looking at Prokhor, went on in a changed tone. Thanks for the treat. I'm off now. Keep well. If I return, I'll drop in towards evening. Clear that bottle away, for if your wife comes home, she'll smash a frying pan over your back. Prokhor accompanied him to the steps and whispered in the porch, Pantelyevich, see they don't fix you there. I will, Griagor answered in a reserved tone. He did not go home, but dropped down to the river, untied someone's boat from the landing stage, bailed the water out with his palms, then pulled a stake out of the fence, broke the ice to make a channel, and rowed to the farther side. Dark green, wind-lashed waves were rolling westward along the Don. In the quiet water by the banks they broke away the fragile, transparent, thin ice, and sent the emerald strands of waterweed swaying. Over the banks hung the crystal tinkle of colliding ice. The riverside shingle softly hissed as it was washed by the water. But in the middle of the river, where the current was swift and steady, Griagor heard only the muffled plash and seething of waves piling against the left side of the boat, and the low, deep, incessant roar of the wind in the Donside forest. He dragged the boat half out of the water, then squatted down, removed his boots, and carefully rewound his leg rags to make walking easier. He arrived at Vyazhenska towards midday. The regional military commissariat was crowded and noisy. Telephone bells were ringing sharply, doors were slammed, armed men went in and out, the dry rattle of typewriters came from various rooms. In the corner, a couple of dozen Red Army men stood surrounding a stocky little man dressed in a flounced sheepskin jacket, talking and interrupting one another excitedly and roaring with laughter. As Griagor walked along the corridor, 2 Red Army men wheeled out a machine gun from a room beyond. Its small wheels clattered softly on the uneven wooden floor. One of the gunners, a beefy, hefty man, jokingly shouted, "Now then, out of the way or I'll crush you." It looks as though they're really going off to suppress a rising, Griagor thought. He was not detained long over the registration. After hurriedly noting his papers, the secretary of the military commissariat said, "Go to the political department of the Don Cheka. As a former officer, you'll have to report to them." "Very well," Griagor saluted, in no way betraying the agitation which had taken possession of him. In the square, he halted irresolutely. He ought to go to the political department, but all his being was resisting violently. "They'll clap you in prison," an inward voice told him, and he shivered with fear and loathing. He stood by the school fence, gazing with unseeing eyes at the dunged earth, and saw himself with bound arms, descending a dirty ladder into a cellar, and behind him a man firmly clutching the rough butt of a pistol. He clenched his fists and stared at the swollen blue veins of his arms. And they would bind those arms. The blood rushed to his face. No, he would not go there today. Tomorrow, if you liked, but today he would go back to the village. He would spend this day with his children. He would see Aksinya and return to Vyazhenska tomorrow. Let his foot ache with so much walking. He would go home for just one day, and then return here. Of course he would return. Come what may tomorrow, but not today. "Ah, Melyukhov, it's ages, ages." Griagor turned. Yakov Fomin, Pyotr's regimental comrade, former commander of the insurgent 28th Regiment of the Don Army, came up to him. Fomin was no longer the awkwardly and carelessly dressed Cossack of the Ataman regiment whom Gregor had once known. In 2 years he had changed amazingly. His well-cut cavalry greatcoat neatly fitted his figure, his red mustache was twisted impudently, and all his form, the exaggeratedly swaggering gait, the self-satisfied smile, revealed a consciousness of his superiority and distinction. "What fate has brought you here?" he asked, shaking Gregor's hand, staring into his eyes with his own wide-set blue eyes. "I've been demobilized. I've just been to the military commissariat. Been back some time? I arrived yesterday. I often recall your brother, Pyotr Pantelyevich. He was a good Cossack, but his death was a pity. He and I were secret friends. You ought not to have joined the uprising last year, Melyakov. You made a mistake." Gregor felt bound to say something, and he said, "Yes, the Cossacks made a mistake. What force were you in?" "The 1st Cavalry Brigade." "What as?" "Squadron commander." "You don't say. I'm in command of a squadron, too, now. We've got a defensive force here at Vyazhenska." He looked about him and, lowering his voice, suggested, "Listen, let's move on. Walk a little way with me. There are too many people here, and we don't get any chance of talking." They walked along the street. Looking out of the corner of his eye at Gregor, Fomin asked, "Are you thinking of living at home?" "Where else should I live, of course." "Farming?" "Yes." Fomin commiseratively shook his head and sighed. "You've chosen a bad time, Melyakov, very bad. You shouldn't have come back for a year, or even 2 yet." "Why not?" Taking Gregor by the elbow and bending slightly towards him, Fomin whispered, "There's trouble in the region. The Cossacks are very discontented with the food requisitioning. There's a rising in Boguchar County. You'd be well advised to slip away from here, young man, and quickly. Pyotr and I were great friends. That's why I'm advising you to clear out." "I've got nowhere to clear out to." "Well, watch out. I'm telling you this because the political department is beginning to arrest the former officers. This very week, 3 ensigns from Dudaryevka and 1 from Reshetovka have been brought in. And they're being brought in droves from the other side of the Don. And they're even beginning to put the screw on rank-and-file Cossacks. Draw your own conclusions, Gregor Pantelyevich." "Thank you for the advice, but I'm not clearing out all the same," Gregor said stubbornly. "Well, that's your business." Fomin turned to talking of the situation in the region, of his relations with the regional authorities and the regional military commissar, Shakhayev. Occupied with his own thoughts, Gregor listened to him inattentively. They walked along for 3 blocks, then Fomin halted. "I've got a call to make. So long." Putting his hand to his fur cap, he took a chilly leave of Gregor and went down a side turning, his new shoulder straps creaking, carrying himself erect and with absurd dignity. Gregor followed him with his eyes, then turned back. As he went up the stone steps of the political department, he thought, "If it's the end, then the sooner the better. There's no point in dragging it out. You knew how to do harm, Gregor. Now know how to answer for it." Chapter 8. About 8 in the morning, Aksinya raked together the coals in the stove and sat down on the bench, wiping her flushed, sweaty face with her apron. She had risen before dawn in order to be free of cooking as early as possible. She had boiled a chicken with vermicelli, had made pancakes, had poured cream liberally over small dumplings, and had put them on to fry. She knew Gregor was fond of fried dumplings, and she had prepared this festive meal in the hope that her beloved would dine with her. She felt strongly impelled to go along to the Melyakovs under some pretext, to spend if only a minute there, to glance at Gregor if only with one eye. It seemed quite impossible that he should be there next door and she not see him, yet she mastered her desire and did not go. After all, she was not a girl. At her age there was no point in behaving indecorously. She washed her face and hands more carefully than usual, put on a clean shirt and a new embroidered underskirt. She stood a long time irresolutely before the open chest. What should she wear? Now she had to decide. It was hardly the thing to dress herself in the best on a work-day. Yet she did not want to remain in her simple working clothes. Not knowing what to choose, she knitted her brows and carelessly turned over the ironed skirts. Finally, she resolutely picked up a dark blue skirt and an almost unworn blue bodice trimmed with black lace. It was the best she possessed. In the last resort, did it matter what the neighbors thought? Let today be a work day for them. For her it was a holiday. She hurriedly dressed herself in her finery and went across to the mirror. A faint, astonished smile slipped over her lips. Youthful, sparkling eyes gazed at her curiously and merrily. She closely, severely examined her face, then sighed with relief. No, her beauty had not faded. More than one Cossack yet would halt when he met her, and would watch with flaming eyes as she went by. As she adjusted her skirt before the mirror, she said aloud, "Well, Grigory Pantelyevich, now look out." Feeling that she was blushing, she broke into a quiet, stifled laugh. Even so, she did not fail to find several gray hairs on her temples, and pulled them out. Grigory must not see anything that would remind him of her age. For him, she wanted to be as young today as she had been several years before. She managed, somehow, to stay at home until dinner time, but then could restrain herself no longer, and throwing a shawl of white goat's wool around her shoulders, went along to the Melyakovs'. Dunya was alone in the house. Aksinya greeted her and asked, "You haven't had dinner yet, have you?" "Have dinner on time with such stay-at-homes? My husband's at the Soviet, and Grigory's gone off to Vyashenska. I've already fed the children, and now I'm waiting for the grown-ups." Outwardly calm, by neither movement nor word betraying the disillusionment she felt, Aksinya said, "And I thought you'd all be at home. And when will Grigory Pantelyevich be back? Today?" Dunya ran a swift glance over her neighbor in her finery and said reluctantly, "He's gone off to register. When did he expect to be back?" Tears glittered in Dunya's eyes. With reproach in her stammering voice, she said, "You've chosen a fine time to dress yourself up, but you don't know that he mayn't come back at all." "What do you mean?" "Mikhail says he'll be arrested at Vyashenska." Dunya began to weep meager, angry tears. Wiping her eyes with her sleeve, she cried, "Curse it! Curse this life! When will it all end? He went off, and the children, you'd say they'd gone mad. They wouldn't give me a minute's peace. Where's Daddy gone, and when is he coming back? And how am I to know? I sent them out into the yard, but my own heart was aching. What do you call this accursed life? There's never any peace for anyone, though you scream your lungs out for it." "If he doesn't come back by the evening, I'll go to Vyashenska tomorrow and find out." Aksinya said these words in such an unconcerned tone that she might have been talking of something quite commonplace, which did not call for the least agitation. Amazed at her calm, Dunya sighed, "It's no good expecting him now, that's clear. He came back to his own misfortune. We don't know anything at all yet. Now do stop shouting, or the children will start thinking things. Goodbye." Grigory returned late that evening. He spent a little time in the house, then went to see Aksinya. The anxiety in which she had lived all that long day somewhat blunted the joy of the meeting. By the evening she felt as though she had been at work all day without once straightening her back. Oppressed and weary with expectation, she had lain down on the bed and was dozing. But hearing footsteps outside the window, she jumped up with the energy of a girl. "Why didn't you tell me you were going to Vyashenska?" she asked, putting her arms around Grigory and unbuttoning his greatcoat. "I didn't have a chance to say. I was in a hurry. But Dunya and I cried to each other, each in her own way, because we thought you wouldn't be coming back." Grigory smiled wanly. "No, it isn't as bad as that." After a pause he added, "Not yet." He limped to the table and began to eat. Through the open door, the best room, the broad wooden bed in one corner, a chest with its copper bindings dully glittering, was visible. Everything as it had been in those days when as a youngster he had called while Stepan was out. He could see hardly any change. It was as though time had gone past this place and had not glanced inside. Even the old smell remained, the yeasty smell of fresh brewed beer, scrubbed floors, and a very faint, almost imperceptible scent of faded thyme. It was as though he had last left this house at dawn only the other day, yet in reality how long ago it was. He suppressed a sigh and deliberately began to roll himself a cigarette. But for some reason his fingers trembled, and he sprinkled the tobacco over his knees. Aksinya hurriedly laid the table. The cold vermicelli had to be warmed up. She ran to the shed for firewood, and, panting and rather pale, began to build up the fire at the front of the stove. She blew on the coals, sending the sparks flying, yet she managed to take a look at the huddled, silently smoking Griegor. "How did your affairs go? Did you settle everything?" "Everything went well." "Why did Dunya get it into her head that they were sure to arrest you? She gave me a fright, too." Griegor frowned and threw his cigarette away with a gesture of irritation. "Mikhail's been blowing in her ear. It's he who's making it all up and calling down trouble on my head." Aksinya went to the table. He took her by the hands. "But you know," he said, looking down into her eyes, "my affairs aren't in too good a way. As I went into the political department, I myself thought I wouldn't be coming out again. There's no denying it. I did command a division during the rising, and I was a squadron commander. Such as me are taken up at once." "But what did they say to you?" "They gave me a form to fill in, and I had to tell all I had done during my service. But I'm not much of a hand with the pen. I haven't had to do much writing in my time, and I sat there a couple of hours describing all my past. Then 2 others came into the room and asked all about the rising. They were all right, quite friendly. The other man asked me, 'Would you like some tea? Only you'll have to have saccharin.' 'What do I want tea for?' I thought. 'So long as my legs get me away from you whole.'" He was silent for a moment, then added contemptuously, as though speaking of some outsider, "I proved to be rather watery when it came to settling accounts. I was a bit of a coward." He was angry with himself for having shown cowardice at Vyashenska, and for not having the strength to fight the fear which had possessed him. He was doubly annoyed because his fears had proved groundless. Now all his agitation seemed absurd and shameful. His mind had run on this subject all the way back, and maybe that was why he told Aksinya all about it, laughing at himself and a little exaggerating what he had gone through. Aksinya listened to him attentively, then gently released her hands and went across to the stove. As she made up the fire, she asked, "But how about the future?" "I've got to go and report there again in a week's time. Do you think they'll take you after all?" "It seems like it. Sooner or later they'll take me." "Then what are we to do? How shall we live, Grisha?" "I don't know. Let's talk about that later. Have you got any water I can wash with?" They sat down to supper, and once more that fullness of happiness which she had experienced in the morning returned to Aksinya. Griegor was here at her side. She could look at him without removing her eyes, without having to think that outsiders were catching her glances. With her eyes she could say all without concealment and without embarrassment. Lord, how she had longed for him, how she had worn herself out, how her body had yearned for his great ungracious hands. She hardly touched the food. Leaning a little forward, she watched as Griegor ate hungrily, her misted eyes caressing his face, his swarthy neck tightly gripped by the standing collar of his tunic, his broad shoulders, his hands lying heavily on the table. She avidly breathed in the mingled scent of bitter masculine sweat and tobacco which came from him, the familiar and precious scent peculiar to him. With eyes blindfolded, she could have distinguished her Griegor from 1,000 other men, even by his scent. A deep flush burned on her cheeks, her heart beat fast and heavily. This evening she could not be a really attentive housewife, for she saw nothing but Griegor all around her. But he did not demand attention. He cut his own bread, looked for and found the salt cellar on the stove, helped himself to a second plate of vermicelli. "I'm as hungry as a dog," he said with a smile, as though excusing himself. "I've eaten nothing since morning." Only then did Aksinya recall her domestic duties. She jumped up hurriedly. "Oh, what a head I've got! I've forgotten the dumplings and the pancakes. Have some chicken, do. Eat lots more, my darling. I'll have everything on the table in a moment." But how long and methodically he ate, as though he had had no food for a week. It was quite superfluous to make him a feast. She waited patiently, but at last she could wait no longer. She sat down beside him. With her left hand she drew his head to her. With her right she took the clean embroidered hand towel, and herself wiped her beloved's greasy lips and chin. Then, holding her breath, half closing her eyes so that tiny orange sparks spurted from them in the darkness, she pressed her lips strongly against his. In truth, it takes very little to make man happy. At any rate, Aksinya was happy that evening. Chapter 9. Griagor could not endure meeting Koshevoy. Their relations had been determined on the first day of Griagor's return, and there was nothing more to talk about, nor any point in talking. Probably Mikhail also got no pleasure from seeing Griagor. He hired 2 carpenters, and they hurriedly repaired his small hut. They renewed the half-rotten rafters of the roof, took to pieces and rebuilt one of the tottering walls, fashioned new lintels, frames, and doors. After his return from Vyashenska, Griagor went to the village revolutionary committee, handed Koshevoy his documents, certified by the military commissariat, and left again without a word of farewell. He went to live with Aksinya, taking the children and some of his possessions with him. As Dunya saw him off to his new home, she burst into tears. "Brother dear, don't be angry with me. I've done you no wrong," she said, gazing imploringly at him. "Why should I be angry, Dunya? Now don't be upset," he soothed her. "Come and see us sometimes. I'm the only one of the family left to you. I was always sorry for you, and I feel sorry now. But your husband, that's another question. You and I shan't drop our friendship. We'll be leaving the house soon. Don't be annoyed." "Of course you mustn't," Griagor said in a vexed tone. "Stay in the house until spring at any rate. You're no trouble to me, and there's room enough for me and the children with Aksinya." "Are you going to marry her, Grisha?" "There's plenty of time for that," Griagor said indefinitely. "You marry her, brother. She's a good woman," Dunya said decisively. "Our dead mother said she was the only wife for you. She came to love her towards the end, and often went to see her before she died." "It sounds as if you were trying to persuade me," Griagor said with a smile. "Whom else should I marry, if not her? Not old crone Andronica, surely." Andronica was the most ancient beldam in Tatarsk. She had long passed her century. As Dunya recalled her tiny, doubled-up figure, she burst into a laugh. "The things you say, brother! I was only asking. Don't tell anyone I asked you." "Whoever else I ask, I shall invite you to the wedding." Griagor jokingly clapped his sister on her back and left his old home with a light heart. To tell the truth, he was quite unconcerned where he lived, so long as he could live in peace. But peace was the one thing he could not find. He spent several days in an oppressive idleness. He tried to tackle certain pieces of work on Aksinya's farm, but at once felt that he could do nothing. He had no inclination for anything. The repressive uncertainty of his position tormented him, prevented him from living. Not for a minute did he forget that he might be arrested, and at best thrown into prison, and that he might even be shot. Aksinya would wake up in the middle of the night and find him wide awake. Usually he was lying on his back, his hands behind his head, staring into the darkness, and his eyes were cold and hard. Aksinya knew what he was thinking about. There was no way in which she could help him. She herself suffered as she saw how painful it was for him, and guessed that her hopes of life with him were again receding into the distance. She did not question him about anything. Let him decide it all for himself. Only once, one night, when she awoke and saw the livid glow of a cigarette beside her, did she say, "Grisha, you never sleep. Perhaps you'd better leave the village for the time being, or perhaps we could go off somewhere and hide." He thoughtfully covered her legs with the blanket and answered reluctantly, "I'll think about it. You sleep." "And we could return later on when everything had quieted down here, couldn't we?" He again replied indefinitely, as though he had made no decision whatever. "We'll see how things go. You sleep, Aksinya." He cautiously and gently pressed his lips to her bare, silkily cool shoulder. But in reality he had already made a decision, He would not go to Vyashenska again. The man who had received him last time at the political department would wait for him in vain. He had sat behind his table, his greatcoat flung across his shoulders, stretching himself with a cracking of joints, and artificially yawning as he listened to Gregor's story of the rising. Well, he would hear no more. All the story was told.